Okay, good morning, everybody, and you're very welcome to day 2 of our International Symposium on Transboundary and Collaborative Water Governance. I'm Louise Cullen, and once again, I have the privilege of being your host for today. And yesterday, I think we can all agree, was a great day. I'll be guiding us again through what looks to be another exciting day of discussion, insight, and the theme of this conference, collaboration. Yesterday, we explored the critical role of transboundary collaboration and participatory water governance. Today, we'll continue those discussions. We'll be focusing on ecological modelling, cross-border collaboration, and how we can deliver solutions for future generations. I was struck last night during the conversation over dinner and drinks about just how engaged everybody was with all the topics that were discussed. As I said yesterday, it is rare that I see as much engagement with Slido questionnaires as I did yesterday at every single stage. We covered the global perspective, hearing how communities on the Atrato River had sought recognition for the water that had silently shaped their lives and their history. Their voices give recognition to that river. We travelled the world without leaving the room, from the banks of the Foyle all the way to Colombia, the German-Polish border, to Oman. Water is the common thread, the thing that unites. It's life, it's solidarity, and water is infinitely more than itself. It's peace, it's cooperation, it is sustaining and sustainability. So as I say, today we're talking about the future. This conference is also celebrating 25 years of Loughs Agency and looking to what comes next, the possibilities, the opportunities, and the challenges. So we're looking at those modelling techniques to assess the impact of contaminants on the marine environment, how evidence-based decision-making can improve policy and benefit the environment, and the opportunities for increased collaboration, get people talking and keep them talking. So let's get started. Our first session today is a presentation on that ecological modelling by Professor João Ferreira. Professor Ferreira is the Chief Scientific Officer of Longline Environment Limited, a UK-Ireland aquaculture technology company, and he's Professor at the New University of Lisbon in Portugal. If I can welcome Professor Ferreira to the stage. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I think I should start off by saying happy birthday, Loughs Agency. And 25 years from where I'm standing here, that's a nice age. But I wanted to also think about it in terms of generational aspects. 25 years is kind of the human generation time. So this is wonderful to have the privilege to be here and join the party. I wanted to do something that I've rarely done when I speak in public, which is to dedicate my talk to the memory of Professor John Grant, who passed away in the early hours of the morning. John was a professor at Dalhousie University, one of the world's leading aquaculture experts, and a very good friend of the island of Ireland. There's a lot of people here in my line of work that knew him well. He was one of the people who developed the chlorophyll standard that's used in Carlingford, and we'll miss him. So I think that the talk title that is on the schedule that you've got on the agenda is different from what I've got here to show you. I want to talk to you about soil to sea. This has become a very important topic through the last 25 years or so. And in part, that's been driven by some of the European legislation, and now comparable UK legislation. I think the names have changed, but the tune is reasonably similar. And the way that we've used ecological models to help management of these soil to sea continuum issues, situations in Ireland. I've been introduced anyway, so you know my name, but there should be actually probably a couple of rugby teams worth of other names on here, because we've been doing this for 20 years, and obviously between AFBI, the Loughs Agency, DERA, a number of other agencies also in the Republic of Ireland, and of course a lot of people that have worked directly with me on my team. This is the work of lots and lots of people. I need to give you a little bit of context about what we did and are doing, and history. History teaches us a lot of valuable lessons that are often ignored to our detriment. And then it's been amazing that from a small country, from the island of Ireland, like mine, Portugal, which is also a small country, some of the science that we've developed collaboratively through these decades has found its way into many other different parts of the world. I'm just going to give you one example of that, and then speak more specifically about things which are related to Lough Foyle, to Carlingford Lough, with respect to the ease and the swell projects, and show you some of the results, and then just wrap it up. This lectern here is a bit of an impediment in terms of people viewing slides that are sitting on the left side of the room. There's a URL over there, which I don't know if you can see, longline.co.uk/LA for Loughs Agency /swell, which has got all the slides that I'm going to show. And it's actually got more slides because for time reasons, I've limited the amount of slides I want to show. And in particular, for the results of what we've been doing, I want to focus more on Lough Foyle and less on Carlingford Lough, partly because of where we are, but partly also because those results were presented at the final meeting for swell, which took place in Carlingford in the middle of last year. So here's a bit of history to contextualize. We started working in 2004 on a project called SMILE to help look at carrying capacity for shellfish aquaculture in Irish loch ecosystems. It was the first time that a catchment model was done in that context. Nobody cared very much about catchments. Typically, agencies that deal with the marine side of things and agencies that deal with the land side of things, environmental agencies and so forth, work with their backs to each other, which is a great shame. DERA is great because it unifies that. It's not very common at all. I think the Loughs Agency, obviously by definition, because of the nature of the name, also has to do that, and those are laudable things. They're very good examples for others. The first catchment model was actually done here for the foil. It was a pretty simple thing. It was actually a master's student from the Indian Institute of Technology that wanted to do some work in Europe that did that. And then we had a project called EASE, which was funded through the Loughs Agency. We're jumping about a decade there. And it was notable for better high-resolution models for water circulation. So I'll get to the framework in a second. And then following that, a couple of years later, we did some work for Dundrum Bay, which is a kind of small system that really punches above its weight. Everybody seems to be obsessed with Dundrum Bay in this country. Very nice place, having said that. And pretty much along the same time, we did Swell, which I think quite a lot of you know about, and that involved also the Republic of Ireland. It was an Interreg project. It was a big job. And it was the first time that we were also working with water utility companies, which is very important because they come at this from a completely different angle. It's not an ecosystem angle that they sing to. So it was very nice to try and bring those things together. And in parallel, there was this Living with Water program, which was focused on Belfast, again, also involving Northern Ireland Water and then various other different bits and pieces. So yeah, this is quite a trail. So my friend Mike Elliott, whenever you show a slide like this, and he's actually an expert at showing them, normally calls this a horrendogram. But this particular horrendogram, I don't want to go into the detail of the different components. As I said, all the slides are on the net anyway if you want to pursue this, and a lot of this stuff has been published. But what's important here is the fact that it is a framework and that we're using a set of different building blocks to achieve certain aims. It's a bit like me, taking a train to the airport in Lisbon in Portugal to come here, catching an airplane to come over to Dublin, and then getting a car to drive up to Derry. So there are different tools to get to a particular point. And I think notable among them is the hydrological model. I'm sorry, it's sort of down here, hiding in a yellow box there, but it's basically modeling the catchment. And then obviously on the other side, the part that has to do with the circulation of the water, because water moves, so anything that you deal with on land gets, further complicated by those aspects. And then in the middle of that, a number of other things that look at different components of the ecosystem that are valuable with respect to trying to contribute towards management and policy for those. One of the components that came in when we did both Swell and the Living with Water program was the introduction specifically of the drainage area models. This was something that was pushed for by the water authorities. One of their main concerns, and we'll get onto that in a minute, was to distinguish between the urban and the rural loading of nutrients into these systems. The urban is the one that they have to worry about, because that's where they have to put in the money to try and solve that. And so if they can, explain that a lot of that comes from the rural component, it's somebody else's problem. But in terms of these directives that now exist, such as, well, mainly the Water Framework Directive, I think is the one that affects us more specifically here. These are integrated directives, so they've done away with all these fractured sort of bits and pieces of the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, nitrates and all that kind of stuff, the shellfish stuff that was all kind of in bits and pieces, and they put it all under one umbrella, which means that it, from the point of view of the directive, it doesn't matter where the thing comes from. The only thing that's important is that it either violates or doesn't violate whatever thresholds and ranges are defined, and so in some cases there are measures to be taken. I said I was going to sort of contextualize it a little bit. This is a very different part of the world. This is an area called Deep Bay, which is actually 3 meters deep, but it's a Chinese and Hong Kong sort of cross-border system. So I guess the name is aspirational. We use this software that we developed at Longline. It's called Aquascape. We've mapped about 25% of the world's aquaculture in terms of structures, ponds, and so forth. It's about 4 million different structures, including structures they have there. This is a video. We'll go through it just very quickly, just to illustrate what's happening. So this is just an example of 12,000, roughly 12,000 structures. In this case, they're shellfish rafts in this particular area. It's it's raft culture for Hong Kong oyster. They dry them and then sell them for the festival market in the mainland China area as golden oysters. They're quite nice. I've had a few of those when I've been out there. So the north is the PRC, and then the south is the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. And you can see these dotted lines. These are model boxes that we've used inside the system, exactly the same thing that we've got for the foil and for Carlingford. And as you go down, you start seeing a bit more granularity. This is a very popular word these days, where you start seeing the rafts that are on there. So somebody yesterday was worried about navigation between oyster rafts in the foil, I think. This would, probably be a bit more of a challenge. And we use the Google Earth engine and some clever piece of software called Segment Anything. And what it can do is it can then identify the structures. People are using this to identify fish movements in cages and things like that, which means that we have the capacity then to have some kind of data tags associated with these different structures. I can't help thinking of the foil in this context. But it also means that we can use this to improve ecological models, because we need to know things about stocking density, about areas covered. And these things, as some of you certainly will know in the shellfish industry, are not necessarily a very easy thing to source. And they tend to depend on who you ask and vary from year to year and so forth. So Longline, we're using this in the context of work we have with the World Bank to try and develop some of these registry systems for licensing and so forth in areas such as this one, where everything is unlicensed. So nobody could actually tell you how many oysters are produced in this place, right? Despite the fact that there's like 3 or 4 generations of farming going on. So this is an illustration of the kinds of refinements we've been able to do through the years, in this case with this particular piece of software, that help us also with ecological modeling. And a lot of these ideas came from work that initially actually started here in the island of Ireland, so that's grand. So Swell, I'd just like to acknowledge all the partnership. It's a whole bunch of different organizations, and I want to show you now some of the methodological aspects that we were involved in with respect to the modeling for that. I mean, first of all, what was the point of it? Why do we do this? You know, there's no point in doing this kind of model, this kind of approach, unless you've got good questions that you would like to address. One of them I've mentioned, which is this distinction between rural and urban loading. It's very important, particularly here, and I'll get to that in a minute. The people involved in the water utility sector were very keen on how they would do their capital investments to improve capacity and water treatment in different parts of these systems. And so these models can be helpful for that. The ecological carrying capacity is one of the, I think, overall drivers that we've had since 2004 to try and do this kind of work. As you know, shellfish extract their food from the water naturally, so it's not fed aquaculture, and that means that obviously the resource is limited, and as has been seen in various parts of the world, including across the water in France, in Marais-Nord-les-Rhônes, there's been all sorts of different difficulties with overstocking of shellfish and difficulties in terms of how long the animals take to grow and various other aspects in terms of restricting the food available to other naturally existing filter feeders and so forth. There's a very important aspect that doesn't get mentioned enough, which is the top-down control of eutrophication by these filter feeders. This has got all sorts of relevance, particularly for this part of the world, also for Denmark, where we've been using the same kind of approach, and in the context of these different instruments in European legislation. With that eutrophication control comes the valuation of the ecosystem services, which is something that in terms of these kinds of regulatory services, the US has done quite a lot of work on in the Chesapeake Bay and up in Long Island Sound with the whole sort of concept of nutrient credit trading. And of course, the idea is that we can use these kinds of things for management. Some of the outcomes of the work in the foil are part of a book that was edited by a colleague of ours called Ad Smal, which my late friend John is also a part of in terms of the associate editors. This was published by Springer, and the examples that I have a chapter in there with another colleague, and the examples in there that we show, some of them are from Loch Foyle and from this work. So I think that's a nice thing. So we use physiological models that represent the growth of an individual animal. Again, I'm not going to go through details of numbers. I'm very happy to discuss numbers outside the context of this session. If we do any questions, I'd much rather discuss sort of broader concepts than worry about whether the number should be 0.5 or 0.6. But what I would say is that the fact that we've got these models that represent the growth of these animals through a physiological approach enables us to understand the materials that go in, and it enables us to understand the components that are then external to the system, including the organic losses and the inorganic losses through excretion. Those things then go into population models that are part of this sort of ecological modeling framework, and they give us some bigger numbers and some, I think, more management relevant ideas about the consequences for these ecosystems. So I want to talk a little bit about the SWOT model, the soil and water assessment tool. So this is not the strengths and weaknesses stuff. It's just another acronym with a different letter. And what you can see here, and again, I'm really sorry about the difficulty that you'll have from the other side of the room to see some of these things, is that the two catchments, so Carlingford on the left and Foyle on the right. And as is typical in these kinds of situations, the catchments are rather large compared to the water bodies themselves. They're divided into subbasins, and the model can be used to calculate, to estimate the loading of different substances to those water bodies. And that's the sort of soil to sea coupling. And this is the bit that's often missing when you look at these kinds of things. People are either doing one thing or the other. I don't think I would say that much more about it. The Foyle catchment is almost 10 times as big as the Carlingford one. So that's noteworthy. Perhaps it's important to say that with the work with the Northern Ireland Water people, we ended up with an hourly time step for the model. It usually runs on a daily time step, so that was a bit of a neat trick that my colleague Leo came up with. And it's important for them because of the discharges from combined sewage overflow systems, which is something that's in the UK press on a fairly regular basis for all the wrong reasons. And they wanted to know with that kind of detail how rainfall events affected the way that then the storage capacity was changed by that. There's a lot of detail that goes into this. You can see on the right the mapping of the different uses of the catchment, from urban areas to all sorts of different crops and pastures and so on and so forth. And on the left there's a graph about the slurry application, which is often, a source of discussion as well. But you can see that there's a lot of concerns there with respect to the agricultural part of it. There's details down here, which I guess you guys can't see, of the numbers of cattle and sheep and so forth that you have per hectare. So it gives you an idea of the sort of detail you go in. That we try to go for the best sources possible to find this. And as I mentioned, we were able to integrate urban discharges into the model in a way that we'd not ever done before in terms of detail. Normally those things would just, SWOT does them, but you just say, okay, it's this much because you calculate population equivalents from whatever population centers you have, or what you know about sewage treatment plants and so on and so forth. And in this case, this was much more detailed because they had their own urban wastewater modeling that then came into this. There's something like 200, I think, connection points from urban sources in these models for the two catchments, 300 overall, including the agriculture. So that's pretty detailed. So when you start scaling this stuff up, you notice I'm avoiding talking about numbers in detail. This is a different audience, and I'm hoping that you're not sort of too zonked out or zoned out by all these numbers, because my idea was just to talk around them and just cherry pick a couple of things that I would find important. And I think the most important here, well, first of all, this estimates all the nitrogen loading from all these various different sources, so that's important. The nitrogen per unit area is a good indicator for comparison with other systems, because it's a way of normalizing things. Population equivalence is a way to express everything from heads of cattle to ourselves and to any other nutrient sources into the systems. So it's a good way to calculate also how much it costs to treat and so forth, because you can get that from standard sort of sewage treatment works data and that kind of thing. But most importantly, it's this proportion of rural and urban discharges. So in Carlingford, our calculation is that about 70% of the input is diffuse. In other words, it comes from the rural component. Where we are now, it's over 90%. Okay. The most important message there is that making changes to that in terms of reducing those loads is not a question of building more water treatment plants. And it is super expensive socially and economically. These are areas of the world where people for generations and generations have had pasture and rangeland activities. This is a non-trivial problem if you start to tell people that they have to change all that. And it deals with aspects like reconstructed wetlands and things like that, which cost an awful lot of money. So this is a huge problem. This is just a representation which we can do with this kind of model, in this case for the foil, of this total load and how it breaks down. You can see it's 91% is ag, and then in the model where those big entry points are. Okay, and those are essentially those rivers. I mean, to put it into perspective, when you're talking about Shenzhen 1, Deep Bay, they have 22,000 tons of nitrogen coming in through the Shenzhen River, but that's, any electronics you guys have on you, that's where they're made, in Shenzhen. And so, it's just to put into context for other parts of the world. I think that's probably important to consider. We calculated that the oysters on the Hong Kong side of Deep Bay, because they're not allowed to do them on the PRC side, they have an ecosystem service equivalent to the removal of 7 million population equivalents of nitrogen, which is pretty much the population of the island we're on now. So let me tell you a little bit about the circulation modeling. This is much more detailed than the kinds of then ecosystem model that we do. Excuse me, and you can see that there's a larger scale model for the whole of the coastal area of the Irish Sea, and then in some of these lochs like Carlingford, the amount of little cells, the amount of little cells that are in there is so high that you can't even actually see them there. It's like a black thing. But so these models drive the circulation, and I'll show you an animation of that for the foil. This is for temperature, and it should be starting. No, don't know why this isn't starting. If it isn't, we'll just move on. Does anyone have a way in the sort of mystery bit where all this is to click on that play thing here on the left? Oh, cannot play media. Okay, don't know why. It was one of Microsoft's mysteries. So anyway, so that model would show you the detailed representation of the temperature change in the waters here in the foil through a period of about 6 months at the surface and at the bottom. So the idea is that it can capture some of the stratification of the water and some of the water movement properties that then will condition the food available to shellfish. We go from this very detailed situation to boxes which are coarser, but we have a lot more variables in these ecological models, and we're running them for 10 years, which if we were running these for 10 years, we'd be in big trouble. We'd be here for, I think, a few months. You can see marked over there the aquaculture areas. This is for Carlingford. The northern leases are marked in a different color from the southern leases, so we were able to do that separation. And for the area here, Loch Foyle, again, you can see the mapping of the leases. And as you know, this has changed a lot through the recent years. There's a lot more oyster trestles now in the foil than there used to be. A lot of money coming into these systems. Dutch money came in with the trawlers and the dredgers with overcapacity from Jierske in, I guess, the 90s and early 2000s. A lot of French money here. These oysters are grown to half grown. They go back to Marennes and that area there in France, do some grow out, get a French passport and become fin de clair and sell for a lot more money. And that's the game. And that's one of the big problems here, in my opinion. You'd be hard pushed, and I've tried to find a place here in Derry where you can eat mussels and oysters. And this is deeply worrying for me. And it means that you guys can't say, we all eat these oysters, they're delicious, because you don't have all that narrative here, because you just, eat pork pies and that kind of stuff, right? So what that means is that you don't get the branding. And the branding is crucial because you're not going to compete with Deep Bay, right? Not on volume. So you have to compete on quality. And there are people down in Dungarvan exporting oysters to China because of the food quality and the food security side of thing, which is always a bit suspect down in the PRC. And they're charging 15 euros a kilo, or they were a few years ago, for Pacific oyster, which actually comes from that side of the world. So there you go. So the market is there, and it should be taken advantage of. Let me show you some of the consequences of changing some of these inputs to the system. I'll just have one slide for Carlingford, and then I'll focus on foil and wrapping up soon. One of the things that we can do, so this is the sort of continuum from soil to sea, from the River Clanrye or River Newry all the way down to the Irish Sea, and you can see. So these are box numbers from the ecological modeling, so don't worry about that. I think the important thing here is that if you reduce loading by 50%, you are reducing somewhere between 20% to 10%, perhaps in some cases less. This is just, picking out some boxes to illustrate this continuum of the chlorophyll concentration. We're using the P90, the percentile 90. So without getting into the sort of abstruse bit of that, it just means it's the typical maximum. So we're not looking for this one huge maximum value that it probably doesn't have really any meaning in the wider context. But we are looking for the typical maximum, because that would be the sort of thing that concerns us with eutrophication. And the reason for choosing chlorophyll is because it's one of the biological quality elements in the Water Framework Directive, biomass, phytoplankton abundance, biomass, and composition. So it's one of the things that you have to have some compliance with when you come to then display the results for your various water bodies. Presumably in the UK context, this works in the same way. In the Irish context, it works directly with the European Commission. So that's the way things go. When you do that, for Loch Foyle, again, you can see some reductions, so up to about almost 40%. It's usually, of course, more in the upstream area. That's where most of the nutrient loading comes in. We're talking about, again, things coming in from rivers that have got rural catchments and so on and so forth. So obviously there's some reduction that you can achieve, and that, is probably something to aim towards, but it is very costly for the reasons that I've outlined. For phosphorus, it's less costly because there's a lot of phosphorus retention in soil. For nitrogen, it's more costly. But when you do this, that also has a knock-on effect, of course, on how much shellfish you can harvest, because those nutrients are also driving primary production, and there's detrital organic matter coming in from the catchment, from the rivers, and therefore the animals that are using that as a source of food have less food. So you can get differences again toward these. So these numbers are different from the other ones because these are the bottom boxes. So in the ecological model, we have two layers. So the kind of box 1, box 2, box 3 will be the surface area. And then the higher numbers typically are the ones below that. And so since most of this is bottom culture, that's what we're focusing on. So that's just a point of clarification. But you can see that there in some places that there is quite a significant reduction in terms of what can be produced in terms of biomass, because you're reducing the nutrient load. Then you can do the opposite, which is the good thing about these models, because you can do this kind of thing without social costs. Just that doesn't mean the models are right. Of course, they're not. And if people need to be obviously aware of that, but it does mean that we can test a number of things and at least have some idea of the tendencies. I'm really, really sorry. This poor guy trying to hunt the slide. So what you do get is very significant reductions in some parts of the lot because of the fact that the bivalves are filtering out the chlorophyll. Again, this is the P90 values that you're seeing. From the top, the values are 23, 37, 58, 90, and so forth, just to help out for you, those of you who can't see. In other words, they're quite significant drawdowns of chlorophyll. And as I said, this is a very interesting and valuable weapon in the context of the WFD. And you can see this represented graphically. What you've got here on the y-axis, if you can, is the drawdown of chlorophyll, the difference between chlorophyll through the year with and without the bivalves turned on. You switch them off, you get one thing, switch them on, you get another, you get less chlorophyll. And you can see, particularly in the top part of the estuary, in the head of the estuary, so these red lines, that there are times of year where you get this big difference in terms of the chlorophyll that is measurable or modeled in this case, in the system. And that means that this is, quite interesting evidence, I think, or supports this whole notion of top-down control. And in the book that I mentioned earlier, I showed, I said that it contained a number of things from the foil. This is one of the things that it has, which is something you can really only do with a model. What you can do is you can, that shellfish are removing phytoplankton detritus and therefore drawing down chlorophyll, doing all that kind of stuff. You can't really estimate what the wider effect is on the system unless you're using a model that then deals with the whole system. And in this case, what we did was we're not looking at the typical nutrient credit removal approach, where you're just looking at nitrogen that is removed by oysters or by mussels or by scallops, whatever. But we're looking at actually at their effect on the drawdown of chlorophyll, which is something which is not measurable at the system scale, where you can measure it, but you couldn't then roll back to the reasons why that's happening, because it'll be a bunch of different things. So what we did was, in the model, we did two things. We reduced, so that's the bottom scale there, the loading from 20%, 10%, 50%, 10%, etc. And at the top, we reduced the seeding of the shellfish to see what consequences that had. What you see in red is the estimated cost in terms of nutrient removal, and that's from treatment station type of approaches. So it's actually much bigger than that, those numbers, right? The cost of removing those nutrients by doing treatment at source. And what you see on the top, there's the blue and the green. The blue is the provisioning service. So it's, in other words, it's what the animals are actually worth in terms of sale. And again, I would stress that it's all wrong, because you get the French guys sending half-grown oysters to France and then saying that they're French and making the money that way. I don't know if it still happens, but as I remember in discussions with Kieran and other people before, the native oysters would get bought up by the guys in Galicia and sold, as Ostra de la Galicia, and so that's a bit of a shame, really, in terms of the fact that mostly they were grown over here, and then over there they got the branding. I've eaten them there in the Rua del Franco, do Franco in Santiago. It's very nice, but I imagine some of them were originally from here. But you can calculate also the ecosystem service by looking at the equivalent cost of that chlorophyll reduction. It's actually a lot more than if you do through the nitrogen thing and the nitrogen approach. And of course, nitrogen is a forcing function for eutrophication, but it's not a symptom of eutrophication, whereas chlorophyll is. So that's a better way to look at it. So I just want to wrap this up. I hope to have communicated that these kinds of models are important and do support management. There's a number of things that can be done with them. As was said in the introduction, we're an aquaculture technology company. I was a university professor for 35 years. I haven't been doing that recently. One of the things that I like is product rather than process, and I think universities are not very good at moving from process to product. And it's one of the things that drove us to do this, was to bring us closer to the people who actually are doing things rather than talking about them, and to help with change and to make things happen. This soil to sea thing, it really is, I think, the way to look at these kinds of systems. It's not possible to decouple them. It's basically integrated catchment management. There's always two sides to the coin. So if you reduce the load, it's going to affect the inputs, and it's going to reduce the harvest. And the Dutch have found that out in the Eastern Scheldt with the application of the WFD, which then violates the Habitats and Birds Directive, because there's not enough food for the birds. The birds don't get enough cockles. The Chinese would probably just say, never mind the birds, we'll just have it ourselves, but that doesn't happen here. And so basically, some of these European directives can also sort of act against each other. The WFD, ironically, only considers aquaculture as a pressure. Somebody didn't get the memo, which means that this kind of ecosystem service, and in Europe, that's really important, because something like 50 or 55% of aquaculture in Europe, if you exclude Norway, so European Union, is shellfish, right? And the Norwegians, of course, do all the fish, well, lots of the fish. Well, the Scots do as well, but most of the Scottish stuff is owned by Norwegians, so there you go. So yes, the top-down control is very important. I think it's worth a lot of money, and if this kind of shellfish industry declined significantly in Northern Ireland and in Ireland, it would have, apart from having important social effects, it's also a traditional industry. It would also be pretty punitive in terms of violation of the water quality standards that we have to comply with. So it's just important to keep pushing that button. And in Lough Foyle, we estimated this was worth about 10 million euros. So I've got the URL there for you again. I was wondering if I should finish with this or not, but I think I'm going to do that, because John would have laughed, and he liked that kind of thing. Or what I was going to say was that I've been coming back here, I think, for the last 20 years. So in many respects, I consider myself an immigrant, but I promise I won't eat your pets. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor, for a really insightful, really interesting and very informative presentation. And probably the unintentional takeaway from that is horrendogram, which has just been added to my lexicon, and I look forward to bringing that to my next BBC management meeting. So thank you so much. Our next discussion is around transboundary and international collaboration on marine species acoustic tracking across multi-jurisdictional marine ecosystems. Trots off the tongue, but it promises a lot more. Leading this is Scientific Director of the Ocean Tracking Network, Dr. Rob Lennox. Please welcome him to the stage.
Thanks very much. This works perfect. Yeah, so thanks so much for having me today. I get to talk to you about something that I'm really passionate about, that I've worked on for many years, and that the Loughs Agency has been a leader in here in Europe and globally as well. So we're going to talk about acoustic tracking, and I referred to this a little bit on the panel yesterday, the work that we do in trying to understand species and trying to understand ecosystems through the way that species connect different parts of the world and connect different species to each other. So a quick introduction, I came here from Halifax, Dalhousie University, where I'm a professor, and I also lead the Ocean Tracking Network, which is a major science initiative funded by the Canada Foundation for Innovation. I spent the last 5 years before this in Norway, so I've been working with the European groups as well on collaborative tracking initiatives, and since my PhD, all my research is really focused on animal movement. I wanted to start with something a little bit fun and conceptual, because this is how I start a lot of the classes that I teach on animal movement and spatial and movement ecology, about space and time. And space and time are, from a physical perspective, they're very complex topics to understand and think about. And when we think about animal movement, they move in both space and time. And in order to really understand how and why animals are moving, we need to think about the complexities of dealing with space and time. And to us, space can be described fairly simply as on two-dimensional planes, the way we measure spatial coordinates, and time kind of marches forward. But in a lot of ways, when we're modeling and trying to understand the way that animals move through space and time, we actually are thinking in much more complex terms. And I like to think about the ways that time actually cycles for animals. We have daily and seasonal cycles, as well as annual and generational cycles. And when we're tracking individual animals, or we're tracking populations, the complexities of space and time and the non-linearities of space and time really actually make it complicated to accurately describe the way that animals are moving in their environment, and the way that they're using habitat, and the way that they're interacting with each other. And space and time actually can be much more accurately described as fractals, because they depend on the scale at which you're actually able to measure them. And a lot of my talk today, or a lot of the work that I do, really focuses on how we measure these features in space and time. And animal movement is an extremely ecologically valuable and important process, and it's very fun to study, and it's very fun to talk about. So thank you again for having me to do this. And I really like these papers that talk about resource tracking and the way that animals actually move in their environment in order to capitalize on resources. And resources in the environment is a very broad term. We have a lot of physical resources in the environment, the physical habitat and the environmental characteristics that animals will use to inform their movements or inform their spatial distributions. But there's also very complex and dynamic biological interactions between animals and their food, animals and their predators, as well as animals and diseases, pathogens, or parasites. And the way that animals move also actually facilitates these ecosystem dynamics by moving across boundaries and bringing resource subsidies, transporting matter and energy across boundaries so that ecosystems can continue to function effectively. And this paper in Trends in Ecology and Evolution, or sorry, that one's in Trends in Ecology and Evolution. This Journal of Animal Ecology talks about how subsidies from animals that are moving across boundaries actually form kind of a biological pump that keep ecosystems moving or keep ecosystems well supported. And we can track a lot of these movements and better understand how these resources are moving across boundaries on land using global positioning systems. We're all familiar with these. They're in our phones, they're in our watches, they're watching us all the time, tracking us where we're going, sending our data to different people to sell us things. But we can also put these global positioning systems on animals as long as they are in connection with a satellite, which basically means not under the water. So terrestrial ecologists have the amazing ability to observe the movement of animals kind of independently. It doesn't depend on networks and data sharing quite as much because they can put their tag out on a shearwater like this or on a baboon, and they get the GPS tracks back and they can do amazing things. We learn a lot from the terrestrial ecologists, but we don't really deal with those realities in the aquatic ecosystem because for the most part, our animals are not at the surface and not providing us with GPS tracks. And that is why, and I'll get into this in a moment, but we really depend on these collaborative networks to share information about where our tagged animals are moving. And with a few exceptions, I guess, in the aquatic environment, we can't use these GPS. In small scales, you can use something called a towed float, where you put a float attached to an animal that's in shallow water, and it has a GPS on it on the float, and it sends those data. And they had a nice example of this for some juvenile stingrays. They have a GPS, so technically possible. You can also potentially use these on animals that come to the surface. You might be aware of some of the, or familiar with some of the research done by organizations like OSearch that put GPS trackers on shark fins, and when the shark fins come to the surface, you get the GPS points. Very nice, very cool data. You have a mola, you have tuna jumping out of the water, you have whales, but for the most part, kind of intractable. Maybe you could have a flying fish, not sure, probably too small for a GPS. But we just can't really take advantage of these amazing satellite systems that terrestrial ecologists are able to use to understand movement ecology. And here's a nice image of a shark with, it's a white shark that had a GPS tracker on the fin, and it kind of drew a picture of a shark with its movements. You can see it going up off the coast of Halifax, where I live there, which is very cool. But most marine biodiversity is not at the surface, so we can't really take advantage of these GPS tracking tools. You can see that you have the whales, you have porpoises, you have some species that are very surface oriented, but we need tools that can allow us to track these extremely important and valuable movements under the water. And so, for the most part, we're able to use sound. Because sound travels very efficiently through water, we can use something called an acoustic transmitter that integrates pingers, essentially, that sends signals at ultrasonic frequencies out into the water. And we have this sort of call and response system where the transmitter that's attached to the animal will send out a signal, but we need to have a receiver in the water that's listening for that signal to decode it, to log it, to store it, and so that it can be downloaded. And then we can recreate the path of the movement path of the animals using that. And this has been around since the late 1950s when they first started to experiment with different types of transmitters. I believe this is in the Pacific United States, looking at Chinook salmon movements in the context of some of the hydropower facilities that are there. And over half a century later, this has become a very common and very widely used tool for better understanding and better tracking animal movement and conducting a lot of different studies on where, when, and why animals move. But as you can imagine, one investigator or one group of investigators can't possibly maintain the magnitude of receiver infrastructure that's needed to effectively track all of the movements of these animals tagged with these acoustic transmitters. Will this work? Maybe. Can we hit play on that? No sound though? This is a video that was made by the European Tracking Network, which is a really effective illustration of how this tagging technology actually, or how these tags are actually implanted. Looking like it is not going to work, seeking some confirmation. Yeah, okay. So this video can do a much better job than I can at putting together slides, and I'll narrate it. So you can see these aquatic animals that we have. We want to understand their movements. We want to track what they're doing. Eels moving through rivers out to the ocean. This is a nice mola mola. Tunas, very tractable species for these kind of tagging studies. Not much GPS telemetry possible with them, so we use a lot of acoustic or occasionally light-based telemetry. I tried to cut it off a little bit. Is it possible to fast forward to about halfway through? Can't use GPS, like I pointed out. So what you're probably wondering really is how we actually get these tags on these animals, because with these tags we really have to have. It just restarted maybe. With this system with receivers, we need to have the tags on or in the animals in order to actually track them. So we mostly use surgical methods where we'll catch the animals. We will work a lot with local fishers, both commercial and recreational, to gather a sample of the animals, and we'll use anesthetics to kind of put them to sleep. We'll use a surgical method to insert the tag and suture the wound closed. And we use those internal methods because external attachments tend to have problems with things like biofouling, so algae growing on the tag, or the attachment point will have infections. So lots of research and lots of studies have shown that these internal implantations have been the most effective. And with some species like lobsters, we can attach them to the shell. But the advantage of using these acoustic transmitters over lots of other types of telemetry is that the acoustic transmitters have a pretty long battery life for the most part. So on larger species like large fish or tuna, we can actually track these animal movements for over 10 years. So we can redetect them moving back to key areas. And you can see in this video the way that these animals have been tagged. Each one has an individual ID, and as it moves past one of these receiver stations, it'll send that signal and it'll get logged onto that receiver station. And we go out and we download these receivers, and we're able to start to put together where those animals have moved. And if we can go back to the presentation, thank you for that. I know that was tough to pull in. I thought it would kind of integrate a little bit better. Beautiful. So Ron O'Dore, who started the Census of Marine Life project, he was a professor at Dalhousie University when I was a student there, actually. And he's since passed, but he had a vision that it would be possible to use these acoustic telemetry systems, not just for specific hypothesis testing in one area of interest, but to generate a global network or a large regional scale network, collaboratively tracking the animal movements with strategic infrastructure. So this was a paper that they put together, I think in 2004, that described the way, or the vision for using collaborative acoustic tracking networks to track fish at a very large scale that had never really been attempted. And this post the Pacific Ocean Shelf Tracking System was established in Western Canada and the Northwest United States with these coastal curtains of hydrophones that are essentially lines of stations between channels or across straits to track the movement of animals between key areas. And the Ocean Tracking Network, where I am now working, was originally funded in 2008 to kind of operationalize this vision that Ron O'Dore had to create a network that allowed us to much more effectively track the ocean and the movements of the animals. An Ocean Tracking Network started in 2008, so it's been about 15 years with a large investment from the government of Canada to develop this global network. And what is quite unique about this is that most of these major science initiatives, or all of the other major science initiatives, are Canadian initiatives, whereas Ocean Tracking Network was given this global mandate to support research around the world. And we've been working with the Loughs Agency in particular to help support the acoustic tracking infrastructure that is that's contributed to the Sea Monitor project and the New Straits project. And this is millions of dollars of investment in the infrastructure and the intellectual capital for deploying this infrastructure and managing the data. And we work with hundreds of investigators around the world. We manage data for thousands of receiver stations. It's quite a large scale, and we're making quite incredible discoveries about how animals are moving. So the idea of Ocean Tracking Network and this collaborative tracking is to track using these electronic tags and using this tag receiver system to communicate key information about animal movements, to connect these infrastructures around the world and ensure that if my animal moves into your area, I can know about that effectively. You can imagine the scale globally. There's tens of thousands of these receivers deployed around the ocean. The idea that I might have to get Excel or CSV files from all the different investigators to check where my animals have moved, completely impossible and intractable. We need this kind of network approach. We need this kind of digital infrastructure to quickly match and better understand how our animals are moving within this global network, and transform the way these data are being used by governments and by non-governmental organizations, by indigenous nations, to revolutionize the way that they're able to manage their resources, because they have the data on hand to better understand where and when their resources are moving through space and time, is incredibly valuable and important, and is starting to form the backbone of a lot of management systems. It is really difficult to manage a resource if you don't know where or when it's actually present. So like I said, OTN, we manage data for hundreds of species, thousands of active receivers, and over 1,000 contributors around the world, which is pretty fun, pretty exciting project. And we don't just use these acoustic receivers. We actually are developing and integrating new methods of tracking these tags. So we use ocean gliders. I don't think this is going to work on this type of screen. Nope. We use ocean gliders, which are autonomous vehicles that have acoustic receivers integrated into them, so that we can use these mobile methods of tracking the animals. We also have modems in the receivers. Some of our offshore receivers can actually send the data to the glider, so we don't have to physically go to the receiver to pick up the data. The receiver can send the data to the glider, so we can send a glider on a mission to go over 50 receivers and offload those receivers remotely, which is amazing. We also have a very cool tool called a VMT, which is a Vemco mobile transceiver, which is a receiver that's actually on an animal. So the animal can both send a signal and receive a signal. So we can start to look at proximity of that animal to other tagged animals or to prey or predator species. And at OTN, we're also using these gliders to listen for whales. And we have a very large and important project on the North Atlantic right whale, which is a critically endangered species that likes to swim in the major shipping lanes that are used by ships that are moving into the ports in Montreal and Quebec City down the St. Lawrence River. So the gliders that OTN has are used during the summertime to patrol shipping lanes, listen for whales, and send those data in real time back to Transport Canada, so that they can implement speed limits in certain zones when whales are present. And this program, at least in our part of the world, has really caused a massive expansion in the use of this technology. You can see that these are all the receiver stations in Atlantic Canada that are listening for tagged animals. We're working on cod, Atlantic bluefin tuna, Atlantic salmon, American eel, striped bass, snow crab, and on and on and on. Lots of different species, and moving all the way up to the border of the Arctic and beyond. We have lots of receivers from partners in the Arctic that aren't included here. In the Great Lakes, the Laurentian Great Lakes, I suppose, in North America, they've invested in this acoustic tracking technology in a lot of their lakes to form the backbone of their management. Extremely important and valuable for their walleye fisheries in the Great Lakes, and for the restoration of the lake trout and whitefish fisheries that they're trying to bring back. In South Africa, they've invested in acoustic tracking infrastructure all along the southern part of the country, and they're working with Mozambique and I believe as well with Madagascar to connect their receiver infrastructure. And again, you can think about the scale of this. This is a multi-investigator network. This is not necessarily a national research facility. This is several investigators putting out receivers and using these networks and the digital infrastructure provided by networks like Ocean Tracking Network and European Tracking Network to match the tags and know where their animals are moving within the global network. In Australia, the IMOS, I think they manage 10,000 receiver stations all around the country, and it gives them the ability to track large species like bull sharks and better understand how they're using different parts of how they're connecting different parts of the country, how they're moving in between the freshwater rivers, the estuaries, and the ocean off the Great Barrier Reef. In Florida and up the Atlantic coast into Canada, there's a huge, I guess there's 3 different networks in the Gulf of Mexico. They call it ITAG. In Florida and Georgia on the Atlantic coast, they call it FACT. And the rest of the way up to about Maine, they call it the ACT network. So there's a variety of different networks. The reason for these regions having their own networks has to do with some of the governance there, but they all share data, and it gives the ability to track a variety of different species from large sharks to small forage fish and better understand how the movement dynamics of these fish is related to different characteristics of the species and how they should be managed. And here in Europe, there's the European Tracking Network that's working to aggregate a lot of the data from receivers, from people that are tracking in pretty much every coastal nation in Europe and into Asia and Africa as well. And these networks allow us to identify some we couldn't have anticipated our animals to turn up, but they did. And the fact that we have these collaborations, we have the ability to share the data through these networks allows us to much better understand how these animals are moving. And again, just to emphasize, these are things that we simply cannot do with tools like GPS. Really the only way that we have to do this, other than putting a passive tag just with a number on the animal and having someone recapture it and phone up and report the number, is with these kind of acoustic systems that have the call and response of the tag and the receiver. And I'm just going to highlight a couple. This is a paper that we put together with a bunch of people a few years ago, trying to figure out, okay, what are some of the things that might not have made it into your papers because they weren't really the core focus, but observations that were made that potentially have really important implications for the species and their way they're managed. So an Atlantic tarpon was tracked from the Florida Keys all the way up to Ocean City, Maryland, pretty much the limit of its distribution. A huge migration and indicating the connectivity between the Gulf of Mexico, the Keys, and the northeast United States. There's a lake trout in the top right corner there, which is a species similar to the brown trout here. It was tagged in Lake Erie, and it was tracked in Lake Ontario, which means that it went over Niagara Falls, which is a massive journey and something that people didn't really think that a fish could survive, but it means there's actual connectivity and there's source sink dynamics between Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. There were observations of green sturgeon moving from the Washington, so in the northwestern United States, all the way up to Alaska. So using shelf habitat for feeding. And we start to really gain an appreciation of the amount or the scale at which these animals are moving and what these connections must actually mean for these ecosystems. Those sturgeon are born in the rivers. And that's directly connecting rivers in the northwest United States to feeding banks in the Gulf of Alaska. Very, very cool. And like I said, Loughs Agency has been a leader in this with the Sea Monitor project, installing a line of acoustic receivers across the North Channel, providing the capacity to track animal movements across key corridors in Europe and between European seas. Incredibly important and a big part of the European infrastructure. And OTN's really been proud to work together with the Loughs Agency to help this. We have a couple of our field technicians here from OTN, Caitlin Bate, Cassandra Hardery, who came to help out with some of the deployments. OTN loaned a lot of the infrastructure that went out into the Sea Monitor array. And Now there's a brand new project that spun out of the Sea Monitor project to keep this going because people saw the value of it. People understand, the managers, I believe, understand how important it is to know where and when the animals are moving, and that these acoustic telemetry systems are really the only tractable mechanism that we have to make these observations and to provide these data to management and to management systems to make decisions with data. And the Straits project is supporting this North Channel array, but also an array across the Kattegat Strait in the Baltic Sea, looking at movements between the Baltic Sea and the North Sea, at the Dardanelles in the Black Sea in Turkey, and at the Strait of Gibraltar in Spain. So these are 4 major European straits connecting critical seas to the broader Atlantic Ocean that is allowing European management to better understand how species are moving across these key checkpoints. And although we understand that there is connectivity across these areas, we know that species are moving across the North Channel, the ability to know which species, when, how frequently, that's all data that really is going to be new. And there are some amazing results that have come out of the Sea Monitor project that are going to be able to continue to come out through the Straits project and continue to instrumentation of the North Channel by the Loughs Agency. This paper just came out, really exciting, with Atlantic salmon smolts, the juvenile stage of the Atlantic salmon that moves from the rivers to the estuaries, way out to the Atlantic Ocean, up in the Barents Sea in the north, in the Arctic. But we don't really know, as much as we know so much about Atlantic salmon, we don't really have good data and a strong understanding of where or when these juvenile salmon are moving through space to get to those feeding grounds in the Arctic. And the Sea Monitor array and the collaboration among researchers in Ireland as well as other parts of the UK allowed investigators to tag a lot of these juvenile salmonids or juvenile salmon, to use the tracking infrastructure and to start to identify where and when these animals were getting detected at key areas and key checkpoints along the migration route. And we can start to fill in gaps with this kind of information about key topics like marine spatial planning. What are the important areas to protect because they're migration routes, or when are the important times to protect because they're important migration times? Another one really exciting. Hey, it's Diego. Very cool. They developed a new tag that they could put into a salmon smolt that actually turns off so that it saves battery, and then turns back on when that salmon is coming back as an adult towards the coast. And the Sea Monitor array helped to identify this sort of full life cycle of the salmon for the first time. This is the first time that I'm aware of that a tag like this has been developed, and data like this have been available to actually use this acoustic tracking for essentially the full life cycle of the salmon at sea. Another really cool one, species that I love very much, that you're very, very fortunate to have here, the basking shark. James Thorburn and a bunch of other people whose names you can't read were able to look at movements of basking sharks, and we use pop-up satellite archival tags on basking sharks. They use light-based geolocation. It's not quite satellite, but you can you can get a little bit of information about the spatial resolution of movements out in the ocean with light-based geolocation. But those tags, usually only 6 months at best, maybe you get a year. Acoustic tags, you can get up to 10 years, and you can look at the repeatability of movements, and you can say this is not just a single occurrence of an animal here, but you can start to look at how the animals are moving repeatedly through space and time across core areas, and start to really define and improve your certainty about the importance of key areas. And this is the slide I would really like to conclude with. Thanks to acoustic telemetry, we really know everything, and the ocean is saved. But that's not the conclusion, because that's not real. We know actually very little. We are still struggling to understand a lot about the ocean. We have a little bit more knowledge than we did about some key species and some key areas. We're working very hard for that knowledge to be integrated more effectively into fisheries management, into marine spatial planning, because we do believe that the spatial and temporal dynamics of animal movement across species is of critical importance, and that we have the tools and we have the capacity through these research networks and these amazing researchers, many of them are here in Ireland, to provide these data. But the major changes in the ocean that are occurring are challenging a lot of the knowledge that we thought we had about the past, and previous models and data and assumptions that have been made either weren't true to begin with or are increasingly untrue because of these changes. We're urbanizing the marine environment by adding new infrastructure, impacts that we really can't effectively predict what the outcomes of, and we need these tracking tools in order to test some of these hypotheses. So we have some key instrumentation at places like the North Channel. I mentioned this, the Kattegat Strait in the Straits project. There's a little bit of work towards putting an array in the English Channel, but there are other core areas or key areas that we really could be looking towards for key infrastructures that allow us to track and not just have infrastructure in the water for a year or two and then we take it out, but to really invest in long-term tracking and building capacity for a sustained infrastructure so that we have time series and we better understand what's happening through time. And there's a lot more core species that I think are very clearly going to be priority candidates for tagging and tracking projects to look at the long-term dynamics of these movements and the space use of these animals. And I really believe in this support for long-term monitoring. What the Loughs Agency has done to support the array in the North Channel is really remarkable and very valuable to keep that array out. I think we all can see the value of knowing what's happening over time and not just for 1 or 2 years, but to be able to keep testing and keep building on our knowledge is really valuable. We kind of know where we want to be tracking, and we know where some of the key areas are that are tractable for infrastructure along coastal shelves and across straits. So we need to find a way to develop this continuity of these infrastructures and predictability of infrastructures for researchers so that they know that they have infrastructure out there to leverage. It's very difficult for researchers to both maintain a massive scientific infrastructure and a large-scale research program that leverages that infrastructure towards research. Additional support for research infrastructures that allows researchers to do the research and have that reliable infrastructure available to them is going to be really important. We want optimal use of these infrastructures, so increasing support for key instrumentation at areas is valuable, and we need to support long-term funding for time series, so not just to keep the infrastructure in the water, but also to keep the tags going out so that we can see how things are changing through time and we can respond more rapidly because we have the ability to observe changes and trends as they're happening year to year. And we need to, of course, coordinate across borders for tracking, and that's what we've been able to do effectively through the European Tracking Network and with Ocean Tracking Network, bringing people together. But there's still more possibilities for collaboration because these species, we say it all the time, and it's no surprise. These species don't recognize borders. They are moving across everybody's waters, and a few countries that aren't investing in the tracking or aren't sharing the data results in massive gaps in our knowledge. We also do have a lot of existing data, and we want to make the best use of those. So growing commitments to data archiving and sharing. We have the digital infrastructure available to do that. We have the mechanisms to adopt and accept data from all around the world and to match tag detection. So we really want to make sure that people are participating in these networks. We want to build the digital twin architecture that makes these detections more available to management and to the public so they can see where the animals are going, and we can continue to update them with new data streams as they become available. And the digital twin of the ocean project that Loughs Agency is leading is going to be a big part of this as we try to better understand how we can use these data streams that we're all collecting and put them into a very usable, scalable digital infrastructure that people can use and adopt into their management advice. So how do we do all that? Well, we really want to design, we really want a vision of what we need to know. And we talked a little bit about the ecosystem approach to management, and we need to focus more on the ecosystem approach to tracking as well, because we really have a strong focus on a few key species right now. And it leaves behind a lot of species that we don't have good understanding of. So we do want a more of an ecosystem approach to tracking. We want to know more about how species are interacting with each other and with the environment. We need to have better collaboration and better communication with key European and national agencies about the availability of these data. We want people to know that these are out there and that we can get this information to them. And we want to make sure that they're seeing the value of this and that there's continued support for growing these programs. And we need cost-effective solutions as well. And that can include things like attaching some of these receivers to buoys. Really enjoyed presentations yesterday about some of the possible collaborations with Coast Guard and Lighthouse programs to attach receivers and attach infrastructure so that we're making optimal use of existing platforms and getting data wherever we possibly can. So thanks very much. I really enjoyed getting to share all that with you. It was a lot of information. It was some of it was kind of a lot of the classes that I teach about animal movement kind of condensed into one slide. But I really believe in this, and I'm really happy to get to share and promote all the great work that the Loughs Agency has done in this, and really looking forward to the future where we really see the value of animal movement and we're able to get these data into the hands of people that can use them.
Thank you so much, Rob. That was really fascinating. And I love the fact that a shark drew its own picture, deliberately or not. We're just moving now. Our next item is a panel session with Mark Horton, the All-Ireland Director of the Rivers Trust, Kieran McGonigal, Director of Aquaculture and Shell Fisheries at Loughs Agency, and Professor Ken Whelan, a freshwater and marine fisheries consultant. And while we're just getting set up here and inviting our panelists up to the stage, you've all been getting busy again on Slido, and there are a few questions there for both Rob and Joao. We've got a roving mic, and we might just, if they're willing, put a couple of those to you. So Rob, just to come to you first, the tracking tells us where and when the animals are moving. How do we know why they are moving? Now let's see where your mic has gone to. Yeah. Dermot's multitasking here, yeah. You don't, yeah, okay, you can just, Sarah's delegating here, she's on the panel as well, but yeah, Rob, so tracking tells us where and when the animals are moving. How do we know why they are moving?
That's a great question, and I did not have time to get into that. We have a lot of models that we can use to test our hypotheses or to try to figure out some of the drivers of movement. And a lot of those really focus on collaboration with oceanographers, especially in the marine environment. So we try to essentially extract oceanographic data about currents or bathymetry, so like the depth of the ocean or temperatures. And we can use models that, gosh, how complicated to get.
Not very. I'm just putting that out there.
Yeah. So we can look at where we observed animals and what the conditions or what the environment was like where we observed them, and we can compare that to similar areas spatially with different conditions, and use those comparisons to estimate how strongly they select for certain habitats or certain areas. And that can give us a pretty strong inference about, or a pretty strong idea of why they are where they are compared to what else was available, and why they might be moving or not moving from one area to another, if that makes any sense. So really it depends on having the available data about the environment and having the known presence data. So from the tracking data, we know where they are, and comparing that to other possible areas where they could have been, but they weren't.
So basically data, and a bit more data. Joao, we have a couple of questions for you as well. what someone has put in here, that you mentioned current nitrate emission practices farming are deep-rooted. What steps or ideas would you propose or advocate? And there's one slightly aligned to that, perhaps. Would you envisage possibly a freshwater shellfish solution for the likes of Lough Neagh, which we know is hypertrophic? Yes, the first bit was, you mentioned current nitrate emission practices farming are deep-rooted. What steps or ideas would you propose or advocate?
Well, they're both, yeah, very complicated questions. I think that with the first part, with respect to nutrient control, one of the better solutions is to try and enhance, if possible, what's going on in terms of shellfish cultivation. It will help that. Obviously, there's always a big discussion around moral hazard when you sort of do things like that, because there's this perception that the agricultural community gets a free pass, and therefore then you can do anything you like because the downstream component will take care of it. So there has to be a balance on that. The flip side of it all is when conditions get so difficult that people actually just stop farming. It's a you know, people who don't do that, and we could be talking about land farming or fish farming, just don't realize it's basically a 24/7 job and no holidays and all that sort of stuff. So it's difficult to attract young people into it at the best of times, particularly in more remote areas. And for me, visiting somewhere is all about the landscape, the people, the food, the drink. And it's the idea that, you know, you have large areas that purely and simply aren't used because you've not created the conditions to do that, is a big difficulty. So it's a very difficult compromise solution in a number of places. The Danes, for instance, have done a lot of work, and you probably might speak about that with the riparian component and stuff like that. But, you know, I didn't show the Denmark case study because I didn't have time. But Denmark has very similar problems to Northern Ireland. And
similar kind of economy in many ways as well.
Well, the Danish government, they didn't do a very good job of implementing the Water Framework Directive. And one of the things that they did, they had this very Cartesian, very linear view of management, where they decided that the solution was going to be to reduce fertilizer applications to soil, and that would immediately translate into a reduction of the chlorophyll concentration in the adjacent waters in the Baltic, which basically gets stuff from everywhere, Russia and various other bits and pieces. And that would increase the transparency of the water and restore the eelgrass from the present day 2,000 kilometers squared they have to what they estimate was 6,000 kilometers squared back in the early 20th century. Now, this is daydreaming. In the period of 20 years, what they've done actually, I've done some stuff with a subcommittee on the Danish Parliament about this, what they've managed to achieve. The chlorophyll hasn't changed very much. The eelgrass is pretty much where it was, but the nitrogen content in Danish wheat has gone down 50%. So the Danes can't win tenders on the international market because of the difficulties there. So, you know, it's non-linear management, and it needs to be thought that way, you know, and it's about people as well as, you know, obviously the natural system. The other question is a bit of a deep one, and it's not something that I really want to go to, because of the problems in Lough Neagh are extremely complex. I don't see, you know, freshwater doesn't have really that kind of option in the same way as marine waters do. And, you know, I'm going into some rather muddy waters there, because you start talking about zebra mussels and all that side of things,
yeah.
right? And you know, one of the colleagues here yesterday was saying the zebra mussels selectively do not filter blue-green algae, so, yeah, you know,
they spit it out.
How long's a piece of string?
Yeah. Yeah, indeed. Well, thank you both very much for taking questions. As you can see, you've stimulated a lot of discussion there on Slido, and I'm sure that can be kept going over the coffee break with yourselves. But I'll invite you to take your seats again, and I'll invite our other panelists up for our next discussion. I think Kieran's to come up to join us, Kieran McGonigal. And oh, you're, will be happy enough? Okay, no problems. Well, keep your seats then, that's good enough. Okay, so we have a few more questions there for Joao and Rob, but I'm going to come to our two new panelists here. Mark Horton, All Ireland Director of Rivers Trust, you're very welcome. And we're talking here in this session primarily about transboundary collaboration from different perspectives. From a Rivers Trust perspective, how is that working? You're All Ireland.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I suppose in a way our organisation as an NGO has taken a fairly unique view that we're going to operate across the entire island of Ireland, and there aren't many NGOs that do that. But Rivers Trusts as community-led organisations are focused on protecting and improving their own river catchments. And some of those catchments sit on the border. So you've got, for example, where we are now in the Foyle system, but you also have the River Blackwater, and as you go on, even the rivers that flow into Dundrum Bay, to Dundalk Bay, their headwaters are in Northern Ireland, and that presents a lot of challenges in terms of catchment management. And so what we're trying to do as non-government organisations is encourage as many people as possible to share the data that they have, the knowledge they have, because I'm sure a lot of people in this room will share my frustration when you look at a map and you see Northern Ireland's completely missing, or Ireland is completely missing, and you just have part of the picture. And we can't manage river systems, cross-border river systems, with just part of the picture. So we need to encourage better data sharing, better knowledge sharing on a cross-border basis and on an all-island basis, because at the end of the day, the island of Ireland isn't that big, and we need an all-island approach, in my opinion, to manage our freshwater environment effectively. So that's what we're about, is coming from the community perspective, bringing science to bear, and working with state agencies and anyone else that wants to work with us to look at how we integrate all of our knowledge and skills better to manage our freshwater environment on an all-island basis.
And Ken, you are a consultant. Are you seeing that in practice? Is that integration happening? Is that communication effective?
Yeah, I'm delighted that, and good morning, everybody. I'm delighted that Rob showed a slide of our collective paper earlier, where we looked at that space between Ireland and Scotland and the west coast of Scotland, because I'm a vice president of the Atlantic Salmon Trust. In fact, I shouldn't be sitting up here today. It was my colleague, Melanie Smith, that was to take this place. She couldn't come, unfortunately. But we're really excited about what we're seeing in terms of the transboundary work that's beginning to happen. And we've been thinking a lot about that in the Atlantic Salmon Trust. And we're very fortunate because Melanie took over from me as Research Director of Atlantic Salmon Trust about a year ago. And we tend at these meetings, I'm not trying to insult everyone here, but we tend to reinforce our own views to an extent at these meetings. So that's why having people like Yao and so on come to us is really important. But Melanie is a conservation biologist. She's not an expert in salmon. And she started to look laterally at what we were all doing collectively. Has come up with a very interesting concept. And the reason I'm here today is to ask for your support and your advice in terms of how we progress this. I want you to think a little bit about two presentations. The presentation that Martine gave us yesterday and the presentation that we've just heard from Rob. Now, we're not sitting in Northern Ireland. We're now sitting in Luxembourg. And what has that got to do, would you say, with all we've heard over the last few days? Most of the people in Luxembourg don't realise that they have a really important tributary of the Rhine that flows through Luxembourg that's now being rehabilitated. How do we connect the people in Luxembourg to what's happening in Greenland? And why do they need to be connected with Greenland? Well, they need to be connected with Greenland because the likelihood is that the big multi-sea winter salmon that are now being restored into the Rhine, they're travelling to Greenland. Okay, so they have a pathway that's actually much more complex than anything we've seen so far. We tend to look at anything in saltwater is the work of our marine colleagues, several of whom are with us today. Anything in freshwater, that's our bit. But the fish don't know about this. We heard this from Rob just a little bit earlier. So Melanie has come up with this brilliant idea of bioregions, that we need to start putting our mind to actually think about bioregions in terms of migratory fish. And if you think about the connectivity then that we have between Luxembourg, all of the countries that are in the Rhine Commission, then we have a movement through the North Sea, out up in maybe into the seas around Iceland, and over then to East Greenland, perhaps even to the tip of West Greenland. And we need to have a concept that actually looks at these bioregions. So another example, another very good example, are the chalk streams in the south of England. So the chalk streams in the south of England, most of us that are familiar with them would see them as an entity. But there are actually lots of chalk streams in northern France as well. So again, Melanie's idea is to start thinking about how we can actually look at these regions and how we can manage these regions, which ties in directly to what we've been speaking about for the last few days, rather than a situation where we're artificially dividing up the aquatic world into a salty world and a freshwater world. And what we've done is we've actually put together now a group that's going to advise us in terms of how we develop this concept and how we move it forward and how we integrate it with the fantastic science we've been hearing about yesterday and today. So yes, I'm really excited about this idea of transboundary work. I think it really has struck home. I think people are now absolutely convinced that's the only way we can move forward. And it will shift borders because people will no longer be constrained, as Mark was saying a moment ago, by these artificial man-made borders, but they will think and they will plan in a much more logical fashion, particularly with the threats that are coming at us from climate change. So I'm very excited about what I see in terms of what we might see in the future.
Great, thank you. You're still firing everything in here to Slido, so keep them coming. A few more questions here. Rob, have you noticed migratory patterns having changed to route species towards marine protected areas, and are MPAs effective at increasing species numbers?
I don't think the migratory patterns are changing to route towards MPAs, if I am interpreting that question correctly. The challenge with MPAs is that they are rarely large enough to be effective in what we want them to accomplish. MPAs are extremely important management tools, but we need larger MPAs, and I think the thinking right now is that we want to have a network of MPAs, and that small MPAs are good as long as there's connectivity between those MPAs or among those MPAs. But marine protected areas that are small tend to have a lower efficacy. I think we really need to be focusing on having large MPAs if we want them to be effective at increasing species numbers, because we need them to cover enough area that they cover multiple multiple life history stages for species. So we need to both protect spawning and nursery and feeding grounds for a species in order for that MPA to be highly effective at increasing species numbers. But with the Loughs Agency, we have a proposal in development to have more of a European scale monitoring of marine protected areas in Europe that I think will help to start to address this question, because we haven't done quite enough work at tracking MPAs to have excellent data on this or long-term data. So there's a big push towards MPAs. There's a lot of value in MPAs, but we don't have a lot of evidence right now, at least with the tracking, to know that they are large enough or sited effectively to accomplish such ambitious goals as increasing species numbers.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope that answers Anonymous's question there. Mark, if I can come back to you about riparian strips. This is something that's featured in various future farm development programs and different drives and so on. Is there an interest in this? Is there a passion for it in the rural communities where the rivers, catchments and so on are?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of riparian management for decades across Ireland, mostly driven through agri-environmental programs, where farmers are given payment to do capital works, to put fencing up, plant trees, for example. But these schemes have been relatively short term and they come and go. And now we have the situation where In Ireland, we have the ACRE scheme emerging as the new agri-environmental scheme, whereas in Northern Ireland we have nothing, and we're waiting for the emergence of the Farming with Nature scheme. But farmers I think, are confused maybe about what it is they're being asked to do. You know, we're expecting our farmers, and I'm focusing on farmers because they manage a lot of riparian land, but we're expecting our farmers to be too many things. You know, they're farming day to day, trying to run a business, but we're also asking them to be environmentalists, and not just that, but know about fresh water, about birds, about trees, about air quality. And then when they get home in the evening, they have to be the accountant, and when they're in the shed, they have to be the engineer to fix the tractor. So if you think of any other sector, do we expect a person to know so many things about, you know, such a wide range of subjects? So there is an interest from the farming community in what they can do to not just protect the environment, but also to make their farm business more sustainable, both environmentally and economically. And so what the Rivers Trusts are doing and what other NGOs are doing is providing that non-regulatory advice and support to farmers, because one of the things we encounter is farmers know what they need to do on their farms in terms of there might be a bit of dirty water here, or that there's an area of land they could plant some trees on, but they're frightened to ask the question, how do I do it? You know, what support can I get? Because they fear they're going to expose themselves to, you know, prosecution or regulation or so on. So we're providing one-to-one non-regulatory advice and support, confidential, and then directing them towards the resources that they can access to make these things happen. But one of the things that we're advocating for is that we move away from this short-term, simple capital budget model, that landowners should be recognised for the value they bring to the environment, and a results-based approach, in our opinion, would be a better way forward, because if we then start to recognise the positives that farmers are bringing about in terms of water quality, air quality, habitat, and so on, and there's a financial recognition of that, in recognition of the fact that they may be giving up some of their profitability of their land in order to bring about those environmental benefits, then that in itself becomes an incentive for the landowner to want to do more. So we're not saying that you should pay farmers thousands of pounds or euros to give up small strips of land, but you know, a meaningful sum of money that puts a value on the environmental benefit or the public good that the landowner is generating. And then we can start to have discussions about giving up larger parts of land from intensive agriculture towards flood relief, for example, storing flood water during the winter, or replacing our kind of grassland agriculture with more multi-species swards that have much bigger benefits for biodiversity, water quality, and also for the livestock themselves. So we start to change behaviour rather than just reacting to the scheme of the day and the things that it offers. So it's probably, sorry, a very long-winded answer, but I suppose what I'm trying to say is that landowners generally know the things they can do and want to do on their farms. They need a bit of advice and support on how to do it. But I think we need to be looking at how we support landowners into the future to achieve these things, and make sure those features that we create in the landscape, be they buffer strips or yard measures that separate clean and dirty water, that they stay there and that they're actually enhanced over time.
Thanks very much. And that Farming with Nature package comes in a limited way next year, with a full implementation in 2026, or so we're promised at least. Joao, if I can come to you, there's a question there. How can we enhance the commercial aspect of our local aquaculture? You spoke about how we're growing Pacific oysters to send them back to where they came from.
Yeah, I just wanted very quickly to mention something that I didn't refer in my talk, which is that there is a collection of books about the EASE project that is outside. There's also some sort of call-out sheets, brochures on the SWELL program these are very light things, so it's not something that's going to encumber you when you go home. You know, it's easy to carry. So I do suggest you, if you're interested, that you look at that. It describes a lot of this stuff in much more detail. I just wanted to make one comment with respect to what Mark just said. I was a couple of weeks ago in Denmark. The Danish government is putting 40 billion krona into getting farmers not to farm certain parts of the land. That's about 5 billion euros. So this gives you an order of magnitude for that country.
Wow.
The question of the commercial aspects of shellfish here in Ireland, on the island of Ireland, but more so I think in Northern Ireland perhaps, and in the Foyle, it is complex. Obviously, the first thing that you need to do is grow animals to full cycle rather than just sort of let them grow to half cycle. I mean, the reason the French are here partly is because of the oyster herpes virus. Because of the lower temperatures, then the shellfish are not so susceptible to that. So after they reach a certain size, you can repatriate them to slightly warmer waters, and they do better. But obviously, if you're dealing with half-grown animals and then sending them off so that they get branded by somebody else, then that's going to be a complication. It's like sort of reading a book that someone's half written and expecting it to be, you know, something good. So it's got to be more than that. But then the other thing is making the market. People are not aware of it at all. Apart from the old Van Morrison song about, you know, mussels from Carlingford and things like that, there's really not much else. But you do start seeing in London and in other places, in fish restaurants. I'm very much a fish consumer. The Portuguese, I think, are next to Iceland in the sort of the list of countries that consume the most, at least in Europe, but practically in the world. But you do see Carlingford oysters and things like that on the menu. You didn't when I first started coming here. Actually, I lied. I started working here in the early 90s, but it was more, it was a European project linked to Carlingford. But yeah, so the branding, I think, is the key thing. And that means it has to be investment because you're not going to persuade people to eat here, right? That's a generational thing that might change. It'd be good if it did. It's good for the diet.
If you go back a couple of 100 years, that's what got the native oyster into its situation, because it was poor person's food, yeah.
Sort of, you know, cockles and mussels, the old song, you know, the old Molly Malone stuff. So I think that you have to represent the product with a good name. I mean, in southeastern Portugal, I don't do much work in Portugal really. Most of it is kind of abroad, but there's a particular species of clam which is extremely valuable. Veneribus decusatus for people here who like the biology side of things. It's described by FAO as the grooved carpet shell. I mean, what? Who thought of that? So we rebranded it the Good Clam, right? And that's a better name for it. And we've registered a site called goodclam.org and did all that. And in Portugal, Farmgate, that goes for about 15 euros a kilo. I've seen it on linen tablecloth restaurants in Santander for 200 euros a kilo. So that's the difference, right? And so any product needs a good story. So there has to be money put into that, and imagination. I mean, Ireland's all about sense of humor and all about wonderful things like that, and to be able to tell good stories, you know, a bit of Blarney here and there, it's easy to do. But somebody's got to say, we want to do it.
Great. Thank you. We're in our last few minutes. Ken, you're nodding there.
Yes, very much so, yeah, because I think that branding is really so important. I mean, we've seen that in terms of another area of the work of the Loughs Agency, obviously in terms of angling. And I've been very involved in angling for many, many, many years. And that whole branding, the idea that people get locked into this particular idea and they get locked into that particular country in terms of that concept, it does draw people. There's no doubt about that. And certainly in the past, I've done some work. I did a review on aquaculture for the Irish government. I was involved with a couple of other folks in doing that. And certainly the shellfish end of things in Ireland was very, very much dependent on the branding, and it was very much dependent on, Joe Silk is with us today, very much dependent on the environmental monitoring system that we brought in when I was part of the Marine Institute, in terms of making sure that that branding was actually at the very top level. And people were then asking and requesting shellfish in particular from the area that was closely managed from an environmental and a human health point of view. So I think that whole question of branding and the question of being able to lift the brand is really important.
Thanks very much. As I say, we're just about to wind up, but one question that's got quite a number of votes here is, how is ocean tracking network being used, if it is, by countries who are parties of transboundary fish stock agreements? Rob, that seems down your boulevard.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it kind of goes into the hardcore fisheries management aspects, and that's something that we're really working on with a lot of different groups to try to better understand how the tracking data can be fit into stock assessment models, and that's a difficult one. We're working kind of actively with some stock assessment modelers to better integrate movement data into stock assessments, and I think that is kind of the next frontier for a lot of the tracking data. Is we can we can provide a lot of information about the spatial and temporal ecology, and we really want to better understand how stock assessments can integrate spatial data. I feel like there's another part to that question that I'm not seeing here.
It keeps moving about a little bit there, but well, thanks for that. I think that kind of has covered that element of things, but we're just about to wrap up, but I'm going to ask each of you in a word to say, when it comes to transboundary collaboration. Oh, Ken, yeah?
Sorry, if I might just come to one point. There was a glorious opportunity here a little earlier, I want to mention it to everybody. There was a question here about the collection of tags in terms of landing sites and so on. So through the Atlantic Salmon Trust and with cooperation of our colleagues in IMR in Bergen, we now have a system in place so that through Graham Dyack that works with the Atlantic Salmon Trust, if you have pit tags, will you please send us the pit tag codes? Because we now have an arrangement and we have a website and so on that shows this, so that as mackerel and herring and so on are scanned in these huge big commercial ports, we now have a system whereby we can collect the pit tags from any migratory fish, whether it's salmon or whether it's sea trout. And we've just uploaded about 20,000 tag codes now from Ireland into the system last week. And if you're tagging migratory salmon or sea trout, please send us the codes. And if they do turn up in any of these commercial facilities as a bycatch, we'll be then able to track them back to you. So just want to, excuse me for doing this, but I just wanted to take the opportunity to mention to people that system is now live, and all of my contact details, Sarah and the Loughs Agency have those. Please contact me if you have tag codes to load onto our system.
Great. Well, okay, I'm going to ask you all just to say in one word, when it comes to transboundary collaboration, are you optimistic? Yes, no? Mark?
Yes.
Positive? Yeah?
Yes.
Yes.
Certainly.
Good. Okay, we'll end on a high there. I'd like to thank all four of you, particularly our two unexpected panel members who were great. Thank you so much for stepping in. Joao Ferreira, Ken Whelan, Rob Lennox, and Mark Horton. And I'm sure you'll all also join with me as well in offering our condolences to Joao on the loss of his dear friend, and our sincere thanks for joining us today. Thank you all very much indeed. Yeah. And now next, we're going to have a break, but I'm going to give you the details of your breakout groups that are coming up after your break. So your sessions are group number 1, cross-border, transboundary and collaborative water governance, are in the lobby with Kieran McGonigal, just through the doors. Group number 2, collaborative working for ecosystem management, is in the cargo room with Sarah McLean, and that's through the doors and on towards the back. There are 2 rooms on the other side of the lobby. So Key Largo is one of those. And group number 3, focusing on collaboration for innovation, is in Key West, led by Ross McGill, and that's again out beside the Key Largo room. You've got 25 minutes or so now to grab a cup of coffee, keep the conversation going, because there's clearly a lot more that we didn't get into. Please help yourselves and go into your breakout sessions at 1:15 to midday. Thank you very much. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Great to see and hear all those conversations continuing over lunch, and I'm sure they're going to continue far beyond today. I hope everybody enjoyed their lunch as well. So time now to find out what was happening behind the closed doors or open lobbies of the breakout groups. So if I can invite each of the chairs to come up and share their group's feedback. All of our chairs for the groups come from Loughs Agency. Group 1 discussed cross-border, transboundary and collaborative water governance. That group was led by Kieran McGonigal, Director of Aquaculture and Shell Fisheries. Group 2 was collaborative working for ecosystem management, chaired by Dr. Sarah McLean, Head of Science. And Group 3, collaboration for innovation, was represented by Principal Project Officer Ross McGill. So if I could get all three of you up on the stage, that would be great. Thank you. I'm going to ask each of you just to give us a little bit of an upsum of what you discussed, what you came up with in your groups. So our first group, as I say, led by Kieran, collaborative water governance. So is Ross in the room? Hi. Talk about making an entrance.
Someone going to turn on the TV?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Don't look backwards, it's quite dazzling.
Front,
yeah,
I don't see anything, so yeah, thanks, Louise. So the first group was on cross-border, transboundary and collaborative water governance, and we had a great conversation, great discussion, great debate. Lots of really interesting points on the challenges. Lack of resources were one, the border itself, lack of data, data crossing borders, differences in data crossing borders, sharing of data, the trust between parties across borders when it comes to data sharing, the exchange of data, transparency, divergence in metrics, which is something that's obviously very topical at the minute with the post-Brexit situation in Northern Ireland and Ireland. Administrative borders, recognising that they are a necessary evil, they're always going to be there. We have to meet that challenge. We have to be courageous. We have to address it with the structures that we learned about yesterday, these long-lasting structures like the Loughs Agency, that we can then bring change through the generations. We have an all-island approach that is a challenge at times, and at other times it's a benefit and a success. There's a real challenge in terms of science communication coming out from the discussions that we had, trying to get the evidence base, which is really, really good at times, that's been supplied by international experts that everybody's very passionate about in the room, but communicating that through to the people that make the decisions that really matter. And we're not good enough at doing that, so we need to improve. We need more science, we need better science, but we need to communicate this better science and this evidence base. So that was a real big one. The challenge for cross-border river basin management planning within the island of Ireland and trying to harmonise north and south the implementation of Water Framework Directive. Someone mentioned the red tape post-Brexit, so issues with operating research at maritime boundaries can be an issue at times. There's a little bit more red tape involved there, and blurred roles within the organisations then that are working cross-border. There are blurred roles, so everybody trying to be very clear and concise with exactly what the role is, making sure you're working to your strengths. So that really was the main focus of the challenges that were brought forward to us.
Thank
you. Want me to continue on through all of them, or?
If you feel you've summarised everything that the most important elements.
that was just
some people in the room might be going, well then give us some positives.
Take a breath. Yeah. Some positives. I suppose successes. Loughs Agency was one that was raised as a major significant success story. So obviously, a bit like what Mark said in our session, I won't get paid if I don't say that. I'll be fired on Monday. So Rivers Trust, to give Mark his dues, was always also raised as a success story. Citizen involvement has been a success. The citizen science that is now used to try and drive some of the changes that are happening there on the ground. Projects such as Swell, Source to Tap, EASE, IBIS, the Interreg collaborations that we've all been involved with, the new East-West and the old East-West links and the North-South projects that everyone's been involved with. So And Jan made a really good point about OSPAR and, you know, learning from our history and making sure that we don't forget that there were already pre-existing frameworks and fabrics, that we shouldn't forget the lessons that were learnt back then and apply the same processes to modern day challenges. So that was pretty much our success.
Fantastic. Thanks very much indeed, Kieran. And Group 2, Collaborative Working for Ecosystem Management. Sarah, what were your discussions? How did they sum up?
Basically what Kieran said. We had a really good, really interactive discussion. There were a number of kind of transient sort of themes that transcended all of our conversations. So things around consistency of approaches, transparency, communication that's effective, but it's also transparent, stakeholder engagement, data quality, sharing, management, accountability, and resources. We first of all talked about ecosystem management approaches, and we thought about what the guiding principles really ought to be, the key guiding principles. So we discussed the need for identification and implementation of codes of practice for all disciplines. So sort of standardized approaches which therefore allow for data comparison and integration. This includes things like shared guidelines for citizen science, community engagement and education, which clearly set out aims and objectives so that sectoral expectations are aligned. We were discussing that in order to do this, cross-border management needs to have embedded within it an appropriate participatory model to ensure that everyone is equitably represented. We also discussed how any management approach, cross-border management approach, needs to be rooted in a strong baseline where we can make management decisions that are well informed in the context of the specific ecosystem in question. We then went on to think about collaborative frameworks and interdisciplinary collaboration, and we discussed the need to strategically learn from the past, which I think has come out of Kieran's group as well. Taking forward what works, modifying or scrapping what doesn't. We also thought that there might be learning in other disciplines and other fields and other sectors that we could potentially learn from and integrate into our own mechanisms. We talked about the need for focused approaches that are appropriately resources, to deliver long-term outcomes, and about how there is a need for co-designed regulation that takes all of these concerns into account from the outset, rather than taking legislation that we have and trying to adapt it or repurpose it for things that it wasn't really designed for. This requires identification of responsible bodies and intergovernmental agreements, which take the overarching legislation that we're all working from and turn it into tangible action on the ground. We discussed that doing this needs senior support and resourcing. It also requires effective use of data. So not just formal, what we think of as formal scientific data, but also effective and meaningful use of social and cultural data. So on data, that kind of segued us into our third section. We discussed monitoring and evaluation. We discussed the need to use existing data sets to prioritize resources and action, and also the need for prioritization of filling data gaps. We had a very good discussion then about how prioritization also needs to be transparent and driven by environmental need rather than potentially by anthropogenic drivers, which we all know is something that happens. We discussed the need to ensure that our indicators are real and that our data resolution is on appropriate spatial and temporal scales so that we can accurately inform policy and management. This means ensuring that long-term monitoring of success and failures is undertaken and accounted for. And importantly, which I think is probably the most important post-it that went on this board, understanding from the outset what success looks like and what it is we're actually measuring. We then got on to policy and regulation, and we discussed some of the risks that policy poses in transboundary management in terms of things like inconsistencies and contradictions, potential for creation of grey areas and loopholes, inflexibility in legislation, meaning that sometimes our actions can't be as dynamic as we want them to be, and how this then potentially leads to the spread of misinformation, because we'll get disgruntled about this. We discussed the need for integration of policies across sectors, ensuring that transboundary mechanisms that we do have, Loughs Agency, are effectively used in the context of contemporary environmental need. And we discussed the need to look at all of this holistically to come up with a formal method of identifying risk and risk ownership. And to end on a positive note, we also recognise that there are successful models out there. We need to learn from them, and we need to find ways, perhaps through the use of novel technology, in consolidating this learning from across the world. I think that's what we talked about. And the Loughs Agency.
Did everybody get the Loughs Agency there? Just saying. Thank you, Sarah. That's great. Thank you. And Ross, with your group, Collaboration for Innovation, what were your discussions about?
Yeah, so for innovation in the future, a lot of the same topics and phrases and things that were suggested in the other two groups emerged from ours. I'll start where we finished, which was everybody was in agreement by the end that we should be doing more of these type of events, whether it's Loughs Agency led or on a rota basis, because of the value of having international experience and knowledge brought to the fore, and then this space and opportunity for people to collaborate meaningfully and without any bias, and just to air everything from local issues to the macro stuff. Where we started in the facilitation in the group was with Fáilte Ireland, actually, because they showed and highlighted examples of where they don't see the border as an impediment to the work that they do in promoting places for tourism and visitor experiences. They look at it kind of to like what was said in the discussions yesterday. They focus on destinations and places that everybody wants to go to, irrespective of where the border is drawn. And then they promote them with partners who also want to promote those same places. Case in point, say, the Foyle or Carlingford as tourist destinations. So that was our starting point that took us through then a lot of the challenges that we've heard from that have emerged from the other working groups. Yes, we need a long-term commitment to funding for these types of infrastructure that monitor things on a cross-border basis. But there was a lot of things people mentioned in the group that don't need huge amounts of resources. The citizen science successes that we've had, the cross-border educational programs that aren't huge, resource-heavy projects to run. In terms of innovation and technology, and please, if I'm missing anything, people can shout who are in the group, but we talked a bit about AI, and this, I don't think this really been discussed much at the conference so far, but Loughs Agency, for example, has a program where they've taught their fish counters how to recognize certain species of fish that we monitor and how that feeds into our reporting processes. It's a very intensive, resource-intensive effort by RT and fishery officers and scientists, but the benefits that gives us is almost, we are starting to inch forward towards a real-time management of our lochs and rivers. And I'm sure other organizations here today are trying to do that sort of same thing. But what that means in the real world is that we don't abandon traditional data collection methods or the citizen science stuff. AI doesn't replace human beings, it augments what we do. And we still need that local knowledge and expertise to be weaved into the data collection and how we interpret and visualize the results. So that was a clear, tangible thing that I think emerged about where we're going in the future. And we talked again about the cross-border education opportunities and the need to take the politics out of the cross-border stuff as much as we can and focus on, kind of like what was said yesterday, those issues and themes that run across all communities and that people can get behind irrespective of a border, the stuff that impacts us all. Is there anything else I may have missed? Sorry, I prepared in Trump style, meaning I didn't prepare at all for anything we missed?
No? Yeah, great. Brilliant. Thank you all very much indeed. You were scribbling some notes there, Kieran. You looked quite keen there for a second. Would you like me to leave you alone at this point? You were taking notes galore. It's great. Yeah, no, it's great to see all of that emerging from those groups, and great to see such common threads across all of you. I mean, it's clear from that there is commonality, but there's a need to build. There are structures that you can put in place to support joined up thinking and to share information and help resolve occurs. But also, as I would add to that, shout about it. Don't talk to each other about it, but tell us as well. because I think it doesn't come naturally to us here on this island to say, look what I'm doing, aren't I brilliant? But it's important that we do that in this field, to let people know that work is happening, things are being done, achievements are being made in spite of all the challenges like Brexit and so on. So if you can get that more integrated, holistic approach for environmental management, and yes, there's that long-term need for funding, yes, there are those different obstacles, but there are mechanisms that you can all share together to help adapt and move on and get past things as well. So talk to each other and keep talking and make use of AI whatever way you can, but be careful as well. We all know that. If you're struggling to remember everything that has been discussed today and yesterday, you don't have to. Those boards that you saw are just some of the information that will all be made available on the Loughs Agency website. It's all going to be collated and made available through proceedings. So it's loughs-agency.com. And Ross, you said about, more events like this. Well, good news, you're not the only one. So the very good news is that this event will run again. So put a note in your diary for 2026 and watch this space, because things like this are so important, where people can share their approaches, their knowledge, and support for each other as well. So thanks to Kieran McGonigal, to Sarah McLean and Ross McGill, and also to all our speakers and panellists this morning, Professor Joao Ferreira, Dr. Rob Lennox, Ken Whelan, and Mark Horton. I think no one here can be left in any doubt about the benefit of increased collaboration in this sphere. We've heard time and time again how it's benefiting both the work of all of you as scientists and the environment that you're studying. So my question to you is, what have you heard at this event that sparked something in you? Who have you spoken to with whom you can collaborate in the future? Can you offer someone here something in your sphere that will benefit you both? The boundaries may exist on the maps you work with, but collaboration clearly transcends them. It's been a very productive and innovative quarter century for Loughs Agency, and that has really been marked in style with this very thought-provoking and, I would say, very forward-looking symposium. And as they say in Looney Tune land, that's all, folks. On behalf of Loughs Agency and its CEO, Sharon McMahon, Sharon would like me to convey to you her sincere thanks to all of you for coming, for your insight, your participation, your enthusiasm for every single subject on the agenda, and your generosity with each other in sharing your time and your knowledge. A huge thank you to all of our amazing speakers today and yesterday for their knowledge and expertise, to the staff here at the Everglades for their hospitality, to the audiovisual team who kept all things technical ticking over, and to Dermot, Rachel, and the team at Gray's Communications. Let me add my gratitude to all of those thank yous. Thank you all so much. And please also, I'd like to extend a special thank you from me to Sharon, JP, Lauren, and everyone at Loughs Agency for the invitation to be part of this event and for their very warm welcome. A safe journey home to all of you. Keep the conversations going. And here's to the next 25 years. Keep up the good work. Thank you. Congratulations. That was great. Yeah, it was really, really good.